Welcome to Tough Talk. I'm your host, Paul Taros, and for my first guest is Dennis Marburger, who is a longtime Bloomfield resident, a Republican precinct delegate, has been a delegate to the last two Republican National Conventions, serves on the Michigan GOP State Committee, serves on the 9th Congressional District Executive Committee, the Oakland County Republican Party Executive Committee, is an Oakland County coordinator for Campaign for Liberty, is a board member of the Republican Liberty Caucus of Michigan, head of the Michigan chapter of PANDA, president of the Birmingham Bloomfield Republican Club, and a volunteer with the Michigan 10th Amendment Center. Welcome, Dennis.
Thank you, Paul. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here on the inaugural taping of Tough Talk with Taros. This is going to be tremendous.
Well, welcome. Now, you're a precinct delegate. How long have you been a Republican precinct delegate?
Oh, for a number of years. I think I've won that 4 times, Paul. And that's a very interesting experience. And by the way, I want to go back to when you mentioned about PANDA, Michigan. PANDA stands for People Against the NDAA. And what that group is involved with is fighting against federal kidnapping and the codification within the NDAA of 2012 in sections 1021 and 1022 for the indefinite detention of Americans as well as other people without charge or trial. And being a precinct delegate has...
Let me interrupt you.
Sure, Paul.
You referred to the NDAA. The official title is National Defense Authorization Act. Is that correct?
That's correct, Paul. Thank you for pointing that out. That's a good,
so that has a very flowery title, makes us all feel secure, but it has some insidious provisions in there.
Well, it certainly does. And this is an excellent topic to begin with, frankly. First of all, the fact that the vast majority of federal legislation that has titles like that create an emotional response of, gee, well, who wouldn't be for that, carry inside that legislation, as you point out, some very insidious and harmful things. And the National Defense Authorization Act is the bill for funding of the military. Of course, when you look at American foreign policy today, most of the military, or a large portion of the military expenditures, are for things other than defense of America. But in addition to that, there are other provisions that are put in. And in 2012, or for the 2012 NDAA, which is signed on New Year's Eve, December 31st of 2011, by President Obama, there was the provision, or provisions included, which expanded the targeting of the so-called war on terror that had been mentioned in the authorization to use military force, which also said that Americans may be detained indefinitely without charge or trial. And so this is very troubling, and because we know from history that when these powers are assumed by the government, even though they are not constitutional, are in conflict with the oath of office that the office holders and the lawmakers and the law enforcers take, and even though they are in violation of the spirit and the wording of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, once these are put in place, we are all vulnerable. And so this is a very disturbing thing. And I was involved in some fights here in Oakland County to stand up and resist against this. It took place across the country, and there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. Paul, I would like to point out that at least in Oakland County, the County Commission did pass a resolution expressing concern about this and opposition to the potential damage it could cause. And Jim Runstead from White Lake, who's now a state representative, actually was instrumental in helping that. And Allegan County did something very similar. And the state legislature passed something which, while not sufficient, at least was a first step. But these are the sorts of things, Paul, that I believe compel us, if we're paying attention to what's going on, to become involved. It's much more important than the party label of any particular elected official. It's not about narrow partisan interest. But there's a saying, some people say, you may not take an interest in politics, but politics may take an interest in you. And unfortunately, over the last 150 or so years, and frankly even longer than that, there's been a drive by people in political power to acquire more and more control over our lives, put us more and more at risk for their benefit and for their own aggrandizement, under false pretenses, and a great expense and risk to us. And that's, I think, a very good example of it, a very illustrative example of that.
Okay. So as a precinct delegate, what other campaigns and issues have you been involved in?
Well, thanks, Paul. That's a very good question. Well, and of course, as a precinct delegate, and on the ballot, I noticed, and the wording is interesting, when people vote for precinct delegate, it's done during the primary election. We just had one, and on the tail end of the ballot there, it said if you're on the Republican side, and same thing on the Democratic side, delegate to the county convention. So one thing you do as a precinct delegate is you have the right to go to the county convention and elect delegates to the state convention. And the delegates to the state convention this time around will be voting for the candidates who will be nominated to be the Republican candidates for the various educational posts. At the last state convention, we voted for delegates to be elected to the national convention. But also as a precinct delegate and as a volunteer with Republicans and other people who are liberty-oriented, and I believe that's the key thing, is to fight for the cause of liberty. Thomas Jefferson, that's the only reason why we should have governments, to protect liberty. I've been involved in a number of campaigns. I was active in Ron Paul's presidential campaigns in 2008 and in 2012. I worked for congressional candidates in the 9th District, such as Don Valaric and George Brico. I also was working for Tom McMillan's candidacy when he ran for the Republican nomination in the 8th District 2 years ago. We currently have a candidate in the 9th District, Christopher Morse. And then we also have our state legislative candidates and candidates for local offices, so I've been involved in some of those as well. There's no end to the things that one can get involved with as a precinct delegate, and some people will point out you don't need to be a precinct delegate to get involved, but I think it's a healthy thing for people who are interested to do that because it provides a mechanism by which we can all gather at these various conventions and have interchange of ideas and that sort of thing and help to advance those causes that are important.
Now that's interesting. You said you were involved in Tom McMillan's congressional campaign, but he wouldn't be your congressman if elected. So why did you decide to put effort in trying to get Tom McMillan to be the Republican candidate?
Well, Paul, the reason I did that, of course, the members of Congress vote on things that affect all of us, and Tom has shown, I think through his time in the state legislature and since, that he is quite not only a student of liberty, but a practitioner and an advocate of principles that are very important that would protect that. He has, I think, a very strong character and moral core, and I'm quite impressed with what he's done there, and I feel that, I believe that Congress clearly needs more people like that in office, who when they take the oath of office will actually uphold it. When you look at the rankings of the various Congress people around the country, including, unfortunately, here in the state of Michigan, Paul, there are very few that score a grade in constitutional compliance that would be considered acceptable. It's very common for there to be Republicans who might get 50% or 60% constitutional compliance, and while that looks good compared to most of their colleagues, if you think about it, if you have a child that comes home from school with an assignment with a 50% grade or a 60% grade, is that acceptable? No. Is that what the people in the audience would accept? Why do we accept that from people that take that oath of office, that have such important power and have so much influence on our lives, that we would accept those failing grades? And I believe strongly that Tom, if he were a congressman, would have a higher grade than that, would have a much better grade. I would give examples of people that do have a good grade in this regard, and people can look up, for instance, the Freedom Index from the New American Magazine. Does a really good job of this. Justin Amash in the Grand Rapids area is exemplary in this regard. There was a congressman named Kerry Bentivolio who had a pretty good track record there. I think that's notable. Around the country also, Thomas Massey of Kentucky, Walter Jones of North Carolina, and there were other, and of course the champion of this was Dr. Ron Paul when he was a congressman. And then in the Senate you see several who have a very good record in that regard. I'm thinking among others, Senator Rand Paul and Senator Mike Lee of Utah. I think Ted Cruz actually had a pretty good record according to that index as well. So there are a few, but we need more. The group is growing, but then unfortunately Congressman Huelskamp of Kansas was just defeated in a primary election because special interest groups wanted to get him knocked out of there. And they put, as I think I read, like $2 million into the campaign to knock out a person who is not an oath breaker, but an oath keeper. And so we need to be vigilant, because those of us that are just the ordinary people living here in America today are under assault by elected officials and their bureaucratic special interest patrons at every level. And one way they do that is by having these highly financed advertising campaigns that will besmirch somebody who actually stands up and does the right thing, and they make it very difficult. And there are a number of issues which they will use to twist the record of the incumbent they want to get out of there. And so it really raises, I think, a lot of troubling questions. The nature of democracy itself. I mean, after all, if we have unalienable rights granted by the Creator, why are they put up for a vote? Why do we allow a roll of the dice on unalienable rights granted by our Creator? I think it's something that we need to think about. But since that is the case today, I think it's imperative that everyone who cares about that and who puts liberty first and wants to protect that legacy for their children and those yet to be born need to be involved to get the truth out and to work for the brave souls who are fighting for liberty.
That's interesting. You talked about a lot of money being spent to get a congressman or a senator out. A similar thing happened locally with Congressman Kerry Bentivolio.
Yes, it did, and Kerry was, I think, in a tough spot there, because as we know, whether you look at a local election, as we've seen recently, or congressional elections, when one candidate is able to dominate the messaging, that makes it very difficult. And so I think one thing that we need to do, I think it'd be helpful, is if whenever you see that one-sided scenario, to look at the other candidate's point of view. And it takes more effort, because one person sending out all the mailers has all the ads and that sort of thing, and they say, well, let's look behind the scenes. Let's peel away the layers of the onion and see if we can actually verify what's coming out and compare the two. So it is an interesting dilemma, Paul, because on the one hand, we don't want to have situations where we're telling people, you can't do advocacy or you can't express yourself through these modern forms of communication. I mean, some people do advocate that, but I don't know that that's be a very good idea. I think that's probably harmful. But on the other hand, the special interest groups are willing to invest a lot of money into the political process, because often they find they can get things that they couldn't get through market competition, but they can get through it by being political entrepreneurs as opposed to market entrepreneurs. And so that is a real problem. And I know that Kerry spoke on that. He came to some of our meetings of the Birmingham Bloomfield Republican Club, and he made some interesting points. And of course, the current congressman from that district, David Trott, has been with us once a number of years ago. But that is an issue to keep in mind. And you do have to wonder, I mean, could the grassroots person just from a neighborhood say, well, you know what, I want to run for Congress and see what I can do because I think I have something to offer. It can be difficult, to say the least, if the opponent is very heavily financed, and also if the party, after the person gets the nomination, if they were to do so, doesn't help, then you're really behind the eight ball. And of course, in the 9th District, we sometimes have seen that with our various candidates who've run against Sandra Levin. And Congressman Levin has a record that has a lot to not be happy with. And so it's good that there's some competition for that. But it's difficult if you're the Republican nominee, because the way the district is drawn, it's very heavily skewed towards the Democrats. And so the party looks at it and says, well, gee, do we want to spend resources there or in a district where maybe we more likely get an electoral victory? So all these things raise some questions that we need to consider.
Okay. Now, you also talked about being outspent on the local level. Have you recently been involved in a campaign on the local level?
Well, here in Bloomfield Township, there was a very energetic race for the local offices, and I think there was, including the race for supervisor and treasurer and for the trustees, and the supervisor's race, there was an imbalance in terms of the spending. It was quite a lively race, and it was a little bit closer than I think some people thought. But the other thing that happened that was interesting, and I think objectively all the observers would tend to agree with this, is that the turnout for that was lower than a lot of us anticipated. I know standing at the polls, it's particularly in the morning, there weren't that many people coming by, and we were surprised. The absentee voting was, I think, about normal, maybe a little bit higher, but the turnout of people actually going to the polls was somewhat lower, and so we can think about what that might have implied. But yeah, that was interesting.
Now, you've been a delegate to the last 2 Republican conventions. This past one, you were a Trump delegate. Why did you decide to be a Trump delegate?
Well, Paul, my goal to go there, frankly, was to help spread the cause of liberty and frankly, to interact with people and help to spread the cause of peace and a non-interventionist foreign policy, which are traditional American values that have been lost during the fundamental transformation of America and of our government over, a century plus. And, Mr. Trump has said some things that I thought were helpful in that regard, actually. He's talked about not having these regime change wars. In fact, he enunciated that in his acceptance speech. I thought that was quite good. That was my favorite part of his speech, frankly. And so that was what motivated me to be involved with that. I had been a delegate for Ron Paul earlier, but I should point out that when you're a delegate, and some of the viewers will already know this, others may not be aware of it, but the system here in Michigan, the idea is that when there's an election, typically, if you're from one of the congressional districts, you're bound to a candidate. So for instance, in 2012, Governor Romney won the 9th district here, and so being the Oakland County 9th district representative, even though Ron Paul was a candidate I favored, I said, well, I'll be bound for Governor Romney. Now, when we had the election here, the primary in 2016, they had an interesting formula to try to share with the delegates. As it turns out, each congressional district, the way the votes fell within the parameters, each congressional district had one delegate for Mr. Trump, one for Senator Cruz, and one for Governor Kasich, as well as one alternate for each of those candidates. And then there were delegates who were the at-large delegates at sort of a state level, and that went more for Donald Trump. And the idea was that we were, bound on the first ballot for the various candidates, unless they dropped out or suspended their campaigns. What ended up happening, of course, was that Mr. Trump had a solid majority to get that nomination. So that wasn't really in question, I think, when we got there. But I thought this was an opportunity to go and to try to interact with people and to have some positive input in a number of areas.
Did you see any similarities between the 2012 and 2016 conventions?
Yes, Paul, I did. And I think one thing we need to be thinking about is, are these truly going to be deliberative bodies, or are they something else? I recall that in 2012, there was a lot of concern, as there was this year, and leading up to the conventions, a similarity. Concerns about process, where the process is being done fairly in all the different states. I don't believe that Michigan was involved in that as much as some other states where it was a bigger issue, particularly in 2012. I think in states like Louisiana and Oklahoma, and where it looked like the Ron Paul delegations probably would have been larger, except for things that were done that were maybe outside of the rules. In Maine, our campaign had done quite well. But then getting to Tampa, for instance, a number of the Maine delegates were, I felt, and our campaign felt, were not seated improperly, frankly. And there was a vote on that. They have a voice vote from the floor, and you're in a large arena, as we were in Tampa. And then you say, well, you hear all these people. One can't be sure if all the people who are doing the voice vote are actually delegates, or some of them guests, or some of them people sitting up in the seating, and then not on the floor of the convention. So that's an issue. It was more prevalent even when there was a discussion about rules, and this became, of course, a big topic of conversation, the rules that would govern the convention. What happened in Tampa in 2012 was that they made some adjustments. One of the adjustments was to change the number of states where a candidate needed to have a plurality or majority in order to just be nominated, and then to have nominating speeches and then give a speech himself or that sort of thing. And they raised it from 5 to 8. I think had they not had the problems at the state level, we would have had over 8 delegates anyway, or 8 delegations anyway. But they raised the threshold so that Dr. Ron Paul wouldn't be nominated, and they didn't want his name even mentioned in the convention, actually, which I think was a mistake by the Romney campaign at that time. But we had a voice vote on rules. And I remember thinking, listening to this, it sounded to me like to make that change, which I thought was a bad change, and I think a lot of people from other campaigns felt the same way. It wasn't just one campaign versus another. I believe that the no vote on that might have won. It sounded like we did, but it was close, but it sounded like the no's won. The person chairing the convention at that time, Paul, was John Boehner. He was Speaker of the House. And he said, in his estimation, the ayes had it. Immediately you could hear people from the floor, and I was one of them, calling for division of the House and roll call. He said, as some people trying to cover up our parliamentary requests started chanting USA in order to mask what was happening on the floor. And by parliamentary rules, there should have been a roll call or a division of the House or something of that type. But he said, well, hearing no objection, we move on. Well, of course, there were many loud objections, and apparently he had a teleprompter. People have shown this, and he was reading off this teleprompter. So in 2016, there was something a little bit similar, or was somewhat similar. We had a vote on rules. And the concern about this was, would there be a roll call vote on the rules package that were put together? When you get to convention, you walk down onto the floor. It's a very exciting atmosphere. And on every delegate seat was the platform and the rules already bound. And then some people say, well, gee, aren't we going to be discussing this in the convention? Well, they had committees that put a lot of work into these things, but there might be something that should be considered. In fact, there's a very good state senator from South Carolina named Tom Davis who noticed a contradiction, pages 39 and 40, regarding states' rights and the state's ability to defend the rights of the people. Those two pages were in contradiction. He wanted to have that reconciled, and I was trying to help on that. But what happened was, because we had the vote on rules, I took a voice vote and said that's going to be it, and no more discussion of rules. We were done with that. But the voice vote, and I think you were there as a guest and you heard that, it was very close, and some people wanted to have additional discussion about it. Said, wait a minute, what's going on? Senator Mike Lee of Utah and others were unhappy with that. And so there was, again, there was unhappiness on the floor. And then the question is, if you're the candidate or the candidate's campaign that has the majority delegates and you're pretty sure you're going to win, how do you deal with the minority concerns? And what I've seen at the last two was, I think the candidates that had the majority preferred just to have everything else sort of put off to the side and let's move along. I will say this. I thought in 2016 it was a little bit fairer. I mean, there were some motions from the floor that we heard, and I thought it was, there was more interplay than there was back in 2012. And so that part at least was good. But that was definitely a similarity, and we need to consider what we're going to do. I remember mentioning this problem to the National Committee woman in 2012 about, hey, but the people wanted to have a vote, a roll call vote, or a division of the House, and she said, oh, well, they weren't going to do that. But I don't know, is that really the right way to approach it? You know, and so in this age of TV, some people say it is right not to do that, but I don't know. What do you think?
Well, my question would be, have you seen what took place at the National Convention at the state and local conventions also?
Well, it's a little bit different, but there's no question, Paul, that we've had, and you and I talked about this on the floor of the convention. Of course, you came up to me and we chatted about this. As an aside, Sheriff Joe Arpaio was right there. We were sitting right in front of the Arizona delegation. And it is true that at the local and state conventions, the people we work with, we're always asking for more transparency and for these sorts of things. And so there are concerns about, should we have the roll call vote, or should we just do it as a voice vote, and how do you keep track, or do you do a secret ballot? You know, now at the local, like the county conventions, it's not quite as unwieldy, particularly for in a district caucus or like just a Bloomfield Township sub-caucus. There's a lot fewer people that have to do the voting. But you know, there are concerns about the process and what happens, and are we following the rules? You know, and sometimes it looks like maybe the rules aren't being followed for reasons of trying to get a certain result. Other times it may be just it was a mistake. It wasn't intended to have any sort of particular result. You know, and that sort of thing. So yes, what you see at the national level can happen at the state and local level, and as I mentioned, in these other states, and sometimes here in Michigan, that happens too. And you know, if you're one of the people that wants to bring up something from the floor that may not be in agreement with the people running the convention want, it's tough to get that microphone and to get the thing brought forward. You know, that's just the nature of it.
Okay. I want to touch real quickly, because we're running out of time. You're a board member of the Republican Liberty Caucus. Could you briefly explain what that is?
Yes, Paul. The Republican Liberty Caucus of Michigan works to endorse candidates and promote the cause of liberty through the electoral process. And it has, there's another organization that's similar in some ways, but doesn't do the endorsing. That's the Campaign for Liberty. That's strictly issues-oriented. Republican Liberty Caucus of Michigan is issues-oriented, but also gets involved in doing candidate endorsements and vetting candidates to find those that at the state level, in terms of being state legislators, or somebody could be running for governor, or perhaps for one of the educational posts or something of that nature, or for attorney general or sheriff, people that we would find would be consistent with the causes that we think are very important, increasing human freedom and decreasing the size and scope of government.
Okay. You're also Oakland County Coordinator for Campaign for Liberty. You briefly mentioned that. Who founded that organization?
Well, that's a great question, Paul. Well, the Campaign for Liberty grew out of Ron Paul's presidential campaigns of 2008 and 2012. It's an issues-oriented group where there's no candidate endorsement that goes on, but there's a lot of discussion about the different issues, and the idea is to mobilize and confront in a proper manner, not in an unruly manner, but in a proper manner, but to put political pressure on people who are violating the oath of office and reducing our liberty. And so we want to, because there are plenty of people pressuring them the other way, the wrong way, we provide pressure, we think, in a very positive direction. And we have meetings, for instance, our Oakland County group, we meet at Shields Pizza on the first Wednesday of every month. They have great pizza and salad there. We have lively guests. You've spoken there. And we have a wonderful audience that come from Oakland and Macomb counties. And we'd welcome anybody to come join us at Shields Pizza on the first Wednesday of the month if they'd be so interested.
Okay. You're also president of the Birmingham Bloomfield Republican Club. Who's allowed to attend those meetings?
Well, same as with the Campaign for Liberty. Frankly, anyone that wants to come by and is with the Campaign for Liberty, the Birmingham Bloomfield Republican Club does not charge admission to the meetings or dues. We meet right over here at the Bloomfield Township Trustees Hall. It's very nice of the township to offer us that facility, and everyone's welcome. We welcome all local Republicans to come by, and we bring the candidates in and give everybody their chance to speak to the group, and for there to be interaction between our local grassroots people and Republican candidates and Republican office holders, and everyone who's concerned about improving the governmental situation here in the Birmingham Bloomfield area.
Okay. I noticed you're wearing the same pin as I am. Could you tell the viewers the significance of that pin?
Thank you, Paul. Yes, you and I are both wearing the Forget-Me-Not pin, which references the Turkish genocide of the Armenians by the Ottoman Empire in the 1915 through 1922 period. Over 1.5 million people were killed. It was instituted because the state, the Turkish state, as so many states do, and I mean large national governments, needed a scapegoat. And so they focused on the Armenians who, some spoke a different language, there was a religious difference, and Turkey was doing poorly in World War I, and so they said, let's force these people out of here, and everybody let them take out their frustration on these folks, and it was just horrible. If you've read the stories of it, it's chilling. One person's inhumanity to another person. Of course, they also attacked the Pontic Greeks, the Assyrians, also sometimes other Turks even, the people that were doing this. So it was awful, but we want to remember this and do whatever we can to prevent state destruction of individual human life wherever possible.
Okay, we're almost out of time. You have a tradition of doing a toast to nullification. Could you briefly tell us what that's all about?
Yes, Paul. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison practiced what Jefferson called nullification, what Madison called interposition, as a way to fight against usurpation by the federal government when they overstepped the bounds that were put in the Constitution. And so what they would say is, Madison said the states are duty-bound to interpose, to resist. Jefferson said if it's not in the Constitution, it's null and void. And so in states like Kentucky and Virginia, they defended the right to freedom of speech. When President Adams started to take that away in 1798, and then in the 1840s and 1850s, northern states like Michigan would not enforce the Fugitive Slave Act. They nullified the Fugitive Slave Act to protect freedom and fight against federal kidnapping. So ladies and gentlemen, what we like to do is a toast to nullification.
Nullification.
Thanks, Paul. And Paul, how about a toast to Tough Talk with Taros, his first episode? Congratulations, Paul.
Thank you, Dennis. With that concludes our episode of Tough Talk with Taros. Thank you.